The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. Part 3. Links in a Chain. Now we all worked feverishly. Never had I been so excited. In a few minutes we unearthed a rectangular wooden chest about 3.5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. It was bound around on all sides with straps of rusty iron. On each side of the chest near the top were 3 iron rings, large enough for a hand to grasp, 6 in all. It was on one of these rings that I had stumbled. 6 men could have carried the chest by means of those rings, and all their strength would have been needed for the task. The chest was so heavy that our combined efforts served only to shift its position very slightly. We saw at once that it would be impossible to remove so great a weight. Fortunately, the lid was fastened only by 2 sliding bolts. Trembling and panting with anxiety, we slid back the bolts. In an instant, a treasure of incalculable value lay gleaming before us. The rays of our lanterns fell onto a confused heap of gold and jewels with a glare that absolutely dazzled our eyes. Jupiter fell upon his knees in the pit and buried his naked arms up to the elbows in the gold. At length, with a deep sigh, he exclaimed, "And all this came from the gold bug." After much confusion as to what to do next, we decided that we had to remove the treasure before daylight. It would take 2 trips to get everything from the pit and across to the island. First, we removed 2/3 of the box's contents so that we could raise it from the hole. The articles taken out were left hidden among the bramble bushes, and Wolf was left to guard them, with strict orders from Jupiter not to move or open his mouth until our return. The 3 of us hastened toward the island with the chest, glad now of the dark night that concealed us. We reached Legrand's hut safely at 1 o'clock in the morning. We were too exhausted to start back immediately, so we rested until 2 o'clock, then had a quick supper and started back for the hills. Luckily, there were 3 strong sacks in the hut, and we took them with us. We arrived at the pit a little before 4 o'clock and found everything as we had left it. We divided the remainder of the treasure as equally as possible among us and again set out for the hut, Wolf at our heels. We reached it and deposited our golden burdens just as the first faint streaks of dawn gleamed from over the tree-tops in the east. We were now thoroughly exhausted, but we were too excited to sleep. After a few hours' rest, we all arose to examine our treasure. The chest had been full to the brim, and it took all that day and the greater part of the night to sort its contents. We found even vaster wealth than we had at first supposed. There was a great variety of antique gold coins, French, Spanish, German, and English, which we estimated to be worth $150,000. There was, however, no American money. Some of the coins were extremely large and heavy, but so worn that we could not read their inscriptions. Then there were jewels, large, fine diamonds, 110 in all, 18 brilliant rubies, 310 emeralds, all very beautiful, 21 sapphires, and 1 opal. These precious stones had all been broken from the gold settings of rings, neck pieces, and pins they had once belonged to, and had been thrown loose into the chest. When we picked these gold pieces out from among the other gold, we saw that they had been beaten with hammers to prevent anyone's identifying them. That was obviously the reason why the stones had been removed, too. Besides all this, there was a vast quantity of solid gold ornaments, nearly 200 finger rings and earrings, many rich chains, 83 large heavy crosses, an enormous golden punch bowl, richly ornamented, and many other smaller articles. The weight of these valuables were more than 350 pounds. And then there was 197 superb gold watches, 3 of them being worth $500 each. All were very old, and, as timekeepers, quite useless, since their works had corroded while they were buried in the damp earth. But all were richly jeweled and set in cases of gold. We estimated that the entire contents of the chest was worth $1.5 million. Later, when we sold most of the treasure, keeping a few trinkets and jewels for our own use, we found that we had greatly underestimated its worth. "Legrand, my dear friend," I kept asking impatiently while we sorted and exclaimed over our find, "how did you know?" Later, he kept replying. His pallor and melancholy, I was glad to note, had certainly disappeared, and neither Jupiter nor I were worried any longer about his mental health. Finally, we were done. "Now you must explain," I insisted. "Very well," said Legrand. "You remember that night I showed you the rough sketch of the beetle? You insisted that it resembled a death's head. At first, I thought you were making fun of my artistic talent, and I was annoyed at you. So, when you returned the scrap of parchment to me, I started to crumble it up and throw it into the fire." "The scrap of paper, you mean?" I asked. "It did look like paper, but when I was drawing on it, I realized it was very thin parchment. It was quite dirty, you remember? Well, just as I was about to crumble it up, I happened to glance at the sketch I had drawn. You can imagine my astonishment when I saw a drawing of a death's head, but it was not in the place where I had drawn the beetle. I knew that my design was very different, although there was a certain similarity in the general outline. If you remember, I took a candle and went to the far end of the room to study the parchment more closely. Then, when I turned the parchment over, I saw my own sketch on the other side, just as I had made it. At first I was merely surprised at the remarkably similar outlines. It seemed just a strange coincidence that, unknown to me, there was a skull on the other side, immediately beneath my drawing of the scarab. But gradually I realized something that startled me even more." "What was that?" I asked, dying with impatience for a solution of this most extraordinary riddle. "I suddenly remembered that there positively had not been anything on the parchment when I first made my drawing. I remembered that I had pulled the scrap from my pocket and turned it first to one side, then to the other to find the cleanest spot. If the skull had been there, of course I would have noticed it. I decided to give the matter closer attention later that night, after you left and when Jupiter would be asleep. That is why I did not press you to spend the night, as you planned at first. In the meantime, I locked the parchment safely away in my writing desk. First, I considered how I had found the parchment. We discovered the beetle on the mainland coast, a short distance above the high water mark. When I had picked it up, the beetle gave me a sharp bite, so I let it drop. Jupiter, who is always cautious, looked about for a leaf or something with which to take hold of it. At this moment, we both spotted the scrap of parchment, which I then thought was paper. It was half buried in the sand, with only one corner sticking up. Nearby, I noticed the rotting wood of what appeared to have been the hull of a ship's longboat. The wreck must have been there for a very long time. Anyway, Jupiter picked up the parchment, wrapped the beetle in it, and gave it to me. On the way home, we met Lieutenant Gray. I showed him the insect, and he asked if he could take it home to study for the evening. When I agreed, he immediately put it in his pocket, without the parchment in which it had been wrapped, the parchment which I continued to hold in my hand during our conversation. Perhaps Lieutenant Gray thought I would change my mind about letting him borrow the beetle if we talked too long. You know how enthusiastic he is on all subjects connected with natural science. So he quickly left, and I must have absent-mindedly put the parchment in my pocket. Now, remember when I wanted to sketch the beetle for you? There was no paper on the table. I searched my pockets, hoping to find an old letter or something to draw upon, and my hand came up with the parchment." "But," I interrupted, "you say that the skull was not there when you made the drawing of the beetle." "I was just coming to that. That's the key to the whole mystery," replied Legrand. "When I gave you the drawing, I watched you carefully when you returned it, and I knew that you did not draw the skull." "Of course not." "And no one else could have either." "Then how?" I began, but Legrand was already talking. "At that point I made an effort to remember everything that took place that afternoon and evening. The weather was chilly, a rare and happy accident, and we had lit the fire. You were seated near it. Just as you were about to inspect my drawing, Wolf entered and leaped upon your shoulders. You petted him and kept him off with your left hand, while your right hand held the parchment out of his reach. Because of where you were sitting, your right hand came very close to the fire. In fact, I recall that at one moment I thought the blaze had caught it. But just then Wolf jumped down, and you began to study the sketch. When I thought about all these details, it became clear to me that the heat of the fire must have brought out the drawing of the skull. You know that it is possible to write with some chemicals so that the writing cannot be seen until the action of heat or fire makes the words visible?" "Yes, of course I know that." "Well, you may not believe this, but I had already made a kind of connection. I had put together two links of a great chain. I found the remains of an old boat lying along the sea-coast, and not far from the boat was the parchment, not paper, that Jupiter had used to pick up the beetle." "But what is the connection?" "First, you know that the skull, or death's head, is the well-known emblem of pirates, their flags." Yes, everyone knows that," I said impatiently. "Second, parchment is very durable, lasts almost forever. But for the usual kind of drawing or writing, it is not nearly as easy to use as ordinary paper. So parchment would only be used for an important message, something that would be kept as a permanent record, something that would not be easily damaged. So I concluded that there must be some meaning in the death's head being drawn on the parchment with some invisible chemical.
Then the size and the shape of the parchment supported my idea. Even though one corner was torn off, the original form was oblong, just the size and shape that might have been used for a memorandum, for a record of something to be long remembered and carefully saved.
But there was no memorandum, only the death's head, I argued. I studied it closely.
So did I, continued Legrand. I saw that the part of the drawing nearest to the edge of the parchment was more distinct than the rest, so the action of the heat must have been uneven. I immediately kindled a fire and held every portion of the parchment over it. At first, some of the lighter lines in the skull became darker. Then in one corner of the parchment, a small drawing became visible. At first, it looked like a goat. Then I looked more carefully and saw it was a kid.
I laughed. To be sure, I have no right to laugh at you. $1.5 million of money is not a joke, but you can't make any connection between goats and pirates. Pirates have nothing to do with goats.
But I have just said that the figure was a kid, not a goat.
Kids, goats, it's pretty much the same thing.
Pretty much, but not altogether, replied Legrand. Of course you've heard of Captain Kidd. I realized at once that the animal drawing at the bottom of the parchment was a kind of a punning signature, a humorous way of writing a name. The skull at the top was a sort of a seal or letterhead, so that was the third link, but I was most distressed because there was nothing else.
I suppose you expected to find a letter between the seal and the signature?
Something like that. The fact is, I had a feeling of some vast good fortune about to happen. I can't say why. Perhaps, after all, it was more wishful thinking than anything else, and Jupiter's silly words about the bug being of solid gold kept running through my head. And then there was the strange coincidences, that this should all happen on the one full day in the year which was cool enough for a fire, and that without the fire, without lending the beetle to Lieutenant Gray, or without the dog coming in at the very moment, or indeed without your unexpected visit, I should never have become aware of the death's head.
Go on, please. I can't wait to learn how you figured it out.
You know all the stories, the 1,000 vague rumors about Kidd burying money somewhere along the Atlantic coast? Well, I believe that those thousands of rumors must have had some basis, and the fact that the rumors were all so similar and had lasted so long to mean that the buried treasure was still buried. Remember, all those stories were about money seekers, not about money finders. If Kidd had hidden the treasure and afterward recovered it, the rumors would not have lasted. Have you ever heard of any important treasure being unearthed along the coast?
Never.
Exactly, so I took it for granted that the earth still held it. Kidd certainly had intended to claim his treasure. All the stories about him attest to that. So I decided that some accident must have prevented him from recovering it. This accident must have been known to his followers, who then tried to find it themselves, but they could not, because they had no way of knowing where it was either. Probably it was all this digging and prowling that led to all the rumors in the first place. Now suppose that the reason Kidd did not go back for the treasure was, let us say, the loss of a memorandum indicating its location.
And so you guessed?
Exactly, that the parchment I had so strangely found was the lost record of the place of burial.
But how did you proceed?
I held the parchment to the fire again, but nothing happened. I thought that the coating of the dirt on it might be in the way, so I carefully rinsed the parchment in warm water and placed it in a pan over lighted charcoal. In a few minutes I saw just what you see now.